looking at the other guy who's strong, or gal, or other person who's stronger than you, as a way to helping you achieve your goal and kind of goading you toward excellence. Social comparison, it is an essential mechanism that is ingrained in us. It's automatic, unconscious. It helps us make judgments about ourselves. Like, it's an absolutely basic function of our mind. But again, it's a dangerous emotion. Envy, even emulative envy, can easily devolve into its less positive kinds. Yeah. I hope none of my students are listening to this.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Surprising Ethics, the podcast that always promises you a surprising idea from ethics or political theory in every single episode. So, envy. It doesn't have the best reputation, does it? The status quo, and we always start with the status quo, of course, before the surprises roll in, says that we should not feel good about feeling envy. Envy is always, or usually, a vice. Whether we feel envy because our sibling got a new job, our friend bought a new house, or that person across the bar is just so much more beautiful than us, we shouldn't act on envy, and we should probably be ashamed of it. That's the status quo. One of the most famous French writers of the 17th century said, "Envy is so sneaking and shameful, we dare never confess it." And Chaucer, the 12th century writer, often called the father of English literature, said, "Envy is against all virtues and all goodness." He goes on to say, look, basically all sins are pretty fun. Think of lust and gluttony. But then he says, but envy has within it only anguish and sorrow. And in Christian theology, which exerts quite an influence on many societies around the world, envy has a place among the 7 deadly sins. Famously, these sins are also called cardinal sins or capital sins. But I only just realised that apparently that means they're the kind of sin from which all other sin and wrongness flows, which is quite the accolade. But in the last few years, people have been questioning this view. Several psychologists have argued that we shouldn't be so ashamed to feel some types of envy. And philosophers have got involved too. One contemporary philosopher argues that envy can actually be good, really good, sometimes even a virtue. This theorist splits the cardinal sin of envy into 4 types and heralds one of them not as a sin, but as a great driver of human progress. And her name is Sara Protasi, and I'm pleased to say that she is our guest today. Protasi is an associate professor of the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma in the US, which is near Seattle, and she's the author of the Cambridge University book, The Philosophy of Envy. Our conversation covers, in this order, the role of envy in human life, envy versus jealousy, whether envy is morally bad, good, or even virtuous, and why, the role of envy in self-improvement and productivity, the relationship between envy, wellness, and serenity, the inescapability of social comparison, whether self-esteem must always be comparative and competitive, or whether we can embrace a radical self-acceptance, whether the experience of envy is gendered, and how envy relates to love and friendship, envy and inequality, whether envy hinders social justice or can even help it, and how racist attitudes often involve envy, with a particular focus on racism against Asian Americans. You'd be helping me in this podcast so much if you follow the podcast in your podcast platform so that the podcast can reach more people. Thanks so much if you can do this. And thank you to the Centre for Research in Ethics, an academic research centre based in Montreal, Canada, for their kind support of this podcast. So without further ado, here is Sara Protasi. So, I wanted to start with experience rather than philosophy. So I wondered if you could paint a picture of the role that envy plays in a typical human life? Like, what are some common struggles that people have with envy from your experience, either just anecdotally or from the research? And also, a kind of bonus question is, what things do you think people envy the most?
Wow. Okay. So we're starting with a small question. The short answer, to start from the end, is that people envy everything and anything, and I will expand on that. And also that I think, in terms of when envy arises in one's life, really it arises in a variety of circumstances from a very early age. So the research shows that even small children, relatively small children, as I think as young as 4 or 5 years old, feel some form of envy. They might not be particularly sophisticated kinds of envy, but it's a very human emotion that arises pretty early on in life. It does have different forms in children and in adults. And that's because, so actually maybe, it's hard to answer just about experience without also getting into some definitions, right? So what is envy? Envy is this emotional response, which is an unpleasant response, right? Some sort of pain or discomfort that we feel when we are comparing ourselves to another person with regard to something that we care about. There is a couple of additional clauses that I'm going to talk about later. But the fact that we care about the things that we envy people for means that they can be very different, right? Because different people care for different things in different kinds of situations. And so when you're a child, you might envy another child for a toy or candy or having the attention of a teacher or a parent. And actually, children feel a lot of envy, even though they might not recognize it or call it such. And that's because envy is also connected to our sense of identity, and that's one of the clauses that I omitted at the beginning, meaning that we envy people with regard to domains of self-importance, as social psychologists say, which is a fancy word to say that things that matter to us, to who we are as people, the way we conceive ourselves matter. And so, for instance, I'm a philosopher, I'm a professional philosopher, and it's not just my job. Philosophy is an important part of who I am, how I conceptualize myself. And so I will easily feel envy for other people's, for colleagues' professional accomplishments, for instance, when I feel that those professional accomplishments are superior to mine. But I have a good friend and colleague who's an amateur comedian, and she does improvisation. She does lots of theater. That's something I've never done. I don't think I've ever felt envy towards her comedic success, because that's not something that matters to my sense of identity. Now, what happens that it's interesting with children is that because children have not have a developed sense of their identity, they tend to feel envy in a more in a more undifferentiated way. So they will feel a lot of envy for everyone. And I know this is a long answer, but that's the last part of the answer, is that one clause that was missing in that is that envy arises towards people that we perceive as relevantly similar to us. Because in that case, the comparison is more helpful and a diagnostic, right? It tells us something more interesting. So I'm not going to envy a Nobel Prize, assuming there was a Nobel Prize in philosophy, which there isn't, but let's imagine there was. I am not a super famous philosopher, and so I'm not Nobel Prize level, so to speak. And so I wouldn't envy someone at that level because they're too far away from me. It's not, the comparison doesn't make sense. I would envy people in my department or in my age group or people that I know, things like that. Instead, with children, they don't still understand how the world works. And especially when they're very small, you know how sometimes children don't even understand that things have different sizes and that the moon is not, as small as it looks like, things like that. So similarly, when they're pretty small and they haven't developed the right kind of cognitive skills, they don't understand that, say, an adult is going to be much better than them at many things. And so they might feel envy even in a way that is inappropriate and doesn't make sense, because, they don't realize that, of course, an adult will be better at drawing than them. So, for instance, my kids used to be really mad at me, really envious that I could draw better than them. And for me, that was silly. I was like, well, of course I can draw better than you. I've had many more hours of practice. And so what's interesting to me sociologically is that we tend to think of children as this kind of innocent creatures, but actually they feel a lot of negative emotions, and they feel a lot of envy.
That's really interesting, yeah.
I promised you short answers, and this was not a short answer.
It's good to know that we get a bit less envious in some way as we get older. We're not, if we start off in the worst case, perhaps. Okay, so envy is related to jealousy and resentment. Can you distinguish envy from those two other states?
Yeah, so there is this conflation that often happens, especially between envy and jealousy in English-speaking context. In some other linguistic contexts, actually, it's a little easier to distinguish them. But so it's been established by social psychologists that there are actually these distinct emotions. In a slogan, envy is about lack and jealousy is about loss. Or, as I like to say, envy covets what jealousy guards. So jealousy is the kind of negative feeling, the painful feeling that we have when we think of ourselves as having something precious, something important, like a relationship, for instance, or an object. And we feel this protective emotion because we fear that someone is coming to steal or to take away this precious good from us. So typically romantic jealousy arises when we see a rival, when we feel there is someone who might take away the object of our affections. And this rival could be envious, right? So they're complementary emotions in a sense, because envy is when we feel this unpleasant emotion that has to do with, oh, that person has something that I want and that I care about and that I don't have. And so envy in a way is a little more aggressive than jealousy. Jealousy is the emotion of the status quo, as a philosopher, Gabriel Taylor, puts it, whereas envy is upset at the status quo and means to change it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you point out in the book that we completely misuse the term jealousy in the English language. And I think you're originally from Italy, right?
Yes.
And so in a way you came to an English-speaking country, the US, and you kind of found us out, kind of uncovered the fake speech that we use to kind of hide away from our own envy. So we say, as you say, oh, I'm jealous of this person, but actually we mean envious. We don't mean that we think they're going to come and take our partner or our existing job. We think that we want to have this person's athleticism or looks or whatever. And so, yeah, like we even say things like, I'm not sure if have you heard this expression, oh, I'm well gel. Maybe it's a British thing, but it's people are kind of almost combining humor and linguistic shuffles to kind of, as you say, like pretend they're not envious when they are feeling envy. And there's sort of this, I think we try to downplay it, right?
Well, and there's a good social evolutionary reason for it, right? In the sense that independently on, the relationship between language and culture and how we've always complicated, but for whatever reasons in English, we don't have a word like in other languages to distinguish between more malicious kinds of envy and more benign kinds of envy. And so naturally, it's the more malicious kind of envy that might induce someone to do something bad to the envied person, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later. That's more salient to us because it's more dangerous. And so that's the dominant sense, the dominant understanding of envy is that it's this very dangerous, malicious emotion that we have to protect ourselves against. And so when we are feeling a kind of envy that may be actually more benign, we need to find a way, and lacking a specific term for it, we need to find a way of signaling to the person we envy that we're not there to attack them. And so what I've noticed when I came to this country is that at first I was like, why are people using jealousy when they mean envy? But then I kind of figured out that people were using jealousy to signal this less malicious kind of envy and to kind of reassure the person that we kind of think of jealousy. Jealousy is an emotion of, especially in a regime of, private property. We feel like, okay, people own in a way certain things and they have a right to protect them, right? So if I have a special relationship with someone, I am to some extent entitled to protect it because it's mine. And so jealousy is okay in small doses. But we think of envy as an unacceptable, it's a deadly vice and all of that. And so we have to signal, okay, I'm just a little jealous. I'm not envious.
Yeah.
And in fact, I have adapted to it. I mean, in a way, it's funny because while with people that I know well and they know me, I will say envious. I will say I'm a little envious or I'm envious of you, especially, I actually say that to my husband or people, that I'm intimate with. I'm not ashamed of admitting my envy anymore. But if I'm talking to people I don't know very well, I will intentionally use the word jealous, even when I mean envious, because I need to adapt to the linguistic and cultural conventions.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So your book, I guess its main claim is trying to counter the kind of status quo that envy is a vice and a kind of terrible thing, and you want to claim something very different. So can you describe to listeners your surprising kind of alternative view of envy and whether it can be good or bad?
Yeah. So my surprising view has two parts. One, which I have to admit is not as original, and it's a conclusion that is shared by an increasing minority, I feel, of scholars. Maybe it's even becoming the majority view, but it wasn't until, a few years ago. And that's the idea that envy is not all bad, and that envy is, like all emotions, evolutionarily shaped, that it has a function, and that function can be good or bad depending by a series of circumstances. And in particular, there's this idea that envy can be malicious or benign. So there is this idea of malicious and benign envy that started to assert itself around 2007, 2009, 2011, when a series of papers came out in social psychology. And the authors were Niels van de Ven and Jens Lange and Jan Crusius, so Dutch and German psychologists, which are actually languages where the linguistic distinction is present. And so they started talking about the fact that there are benign forms of envy. In philosophy, in texts as old as Aristotle's texts, so 25 centuries ago, I think we find actually the seed of this idea. But it was still a minority view. And what I did was to actually intersect the psychological literature and the philosophical literature. So psychologists were thinking that the main factor that decides whether we feel a more malicious kind of envy or a more benign kind of envy is whether we feel in control of the situation. So imagine that, I envy you because you have this fabulous podcast and I am just not capable. I'm not someone who's good at digital media and I don't have the patience to write down questions or script. I don't know how to do any of this. And so I envy you, right? Because I think this is a way of doing philosophy that is very valuable. And I can't do it. But then there are two possibilities. I might feel like, I can learn from you, Will. I'm going to learn how to do this. I'm going to look up to you. I'm going to ask you questions. And then I realize, actually, I can do this. And so I'm still feeling envious because I haven't done it yet. But I feel like it's possible for me to improve my situation. And so I will feel a benign kind of envy that motivates me to level up, to reach your level, to improve my situation and reach your level. Or I might feel very insecure. Maybe I don't have the same resources that you have at your university. I'm not supported. And maybe I'm technologically a Luddite. I don't know how to do these things. And so I will be much more inclined to maybe wish that you don't do as well or try to sabotage you. Or when you ask me to do this interview, I will do badly. So, your reputation is damaged or something like that. And so I will want to, or I tell my friends not to accept your requests for interviews, right? And so I'm trying to pull you down to my level because I don't feel in control. And so I develop this antipathy toward you. So that's the psychological model that was available when I started thinking about this issue. But then for Aristotle, at least according to my interpretation, I think we find these two emotions of zealous and phthonus. And phthonus is this negative pathos or passion, this negative emotion that we feel because the other person is doing better than us. But the pain comes from the fact that it's that person. Right. So the emphasis is going to be like, oh, it's that Will who's always like doing better than me. And I really don't like them and I want them to fail. Or I feel something like, oh my God, Will is doing this amazing thing. And it just looks like an incredible way of doing philosophy. And I want to do it. And I really care about doing philosophy in a modern way that reaches a lot of people. And so then the pain for me comes from the fact that I don't have this good that I really care about. But the interesting thing is that these two different models are compatible. And so what I did is that I kind of put them together. And so I get 4 kinds of envy at the price of 2. And so I have these 4 kinds of envy: emulative envy, inert envy, aggressive envy, and spiteful envy. And I think that this is a picture that is a little more nuanced. And so what's surprising about it is that not only envy is not bad, but there are many varieties of envy. There is not just 1 or even 2. There is 4.
Mm-hmm. So which of those types of envy are good and why?
Good question. Emulative envy is the only kind of envy that I think is good, both for oneself and for others, so morally. So, for example, emulative envy is the emotion that I feel when I think that I can learn how to do a podcast, perhaps by looking at you, by emulating you. I think I'm capable, and I really want to do that because I care about disseminating philosophy to the public. And so I am projected toward goodness, so to speak. And so this is good both for me and for others. Inert envy is an emotion that I think is a kind of envy where I feel insecure about my ability of leveling up, but I still want to level up because I care about the good that I lack. And so it's a well-intentioned starting point that, however, fails and is doomed to fail. And what happens is that this is a self-defeating emotion. And because I care about the good for its own sake, for itself, I don't want to bring you down, but I also don't think I can improve my situation. And so I'm kind of stuck in this kind of sulking emotion. And so maybe, what I do, I just stop talking to you, Will. I don't want to listen to your podcast. I kind of detach myself from the situation because I'm like, this is just not good for me. Mm-hmm. And of course, if we were, we were good friends, there is a sense, this is going to be bad for me, bad for my relationship with you. And maybe, to some extent, it might also sadden you a little bit. But I'm not going to harm you, right? You might just be a little perplexed because, maybe I stop talking to you or something like that. So this is an emotion that it's not good for me, but it's pretty neutral for others from a moral perspective. And then if you feel aggressive envy, that's really pretty bad for others. It's morally bad because aggressive envy is, as the name says, aggressive. And it's the kind of, and this is something that I think it's important to distinguish from the other bad kind, which is spiteful envy, because it wants to take away the good that other people have. And sometimes, unfortunately, in a world that is not fair, that can be good for the agent, right? If I'm someone who's good at tricking others or hiding their misdeeds, there might be some goods that can be stolen. Imagine it's a race. I often use this idea of the race, right? If I trip you and I ride first, I have not become a better athlete. So I have not leveled up in an important sense, but I've leveled down, right? I brought you to my level. And so that's an emotion that is clearly bad for society. It's immoral, but sometimes people get away with it. And finally, spiteful envy. There is this saying that says that envy spoils the good it covets. And again, I don't think this applies to these other the first three kinds of envy, but it applies to spiteful envy. Because what happens with spiteful envy is that sometimes, depending on the nature of the good, we cannot actually steal the good. The only thing that we can do is to ruin it. So my favorite example of this is the very simple case of a child who wants to get the toy that the other kid has, and they're not allowed to share, and the teacher is watching and they can't steal it, but then maybe they can kind of just literally break it, right? Or I'm watching someone eating an ice cream, and the ice cream falls, and that person, nobody gets the ice cream. But I'm like, yes, he doesn't have the ice cream anymore. And this is the worst kind of envy because, of course, it doesn't really, it might give me a short-lived satisfaction, but overall, I don't get the good. You don't get the good. It's just bad for everyone involved.
Yeah. So basically then, to sort of summarize, envy is good for us and as envious, and is morally good and even virtuous when we level up ourselves, when we try and improve ourselves in response to trying to emulate others. So we're not spoiling, we're not stealing, but we're just trying to improve our own self because we see that someone else has something we want.
With the clarification that virtuous envy is even one step up on emulative envy, because, when we talk about virtue, we really want to think about a lot of other conditions, right? So there needs to be also deliberation and choice, so it becomes more complicated. And of course, we also have to assume, I think even in the case of emulative envy, if we talk about genuine self-improvement, we have to assume that the good that we're aiming for is actually good. Because otherwise you would be... So when psychologists talk about benign envy, for instance, they don't make this assumption. And so it could be, I use the example of the emulatively envious torturer. Imagine that, I envy you because you're so much better at torturing people, right? And I really want to emulate you when, okay, that's, I don't want to say that's a good kind of envy. That's bad. That's definitely not virtuous envy. So virtuous envy has higher standards.
So, for example, a case where I'm a, say, campaigner for social justice, and I think I'm a little bit flat-footed or not as good as this very charming, amazing person who's a great public speaker and who is really popular, and I kind of envy their political charm and interpersonal skills, and I work to level myself up to kind of become a better campaigner in pursuit of some just cause. And I do so because I've deliberated carefully that this is a good thing to do, and I think I have good reason to do this. In that kind of case, that would be a virtuous form of envy.
I would think that. Yeah, that's what I would think. Yeah.
Right.
It could also be something. It could be something like an athletic pursuit, right? That maybe if we think that there is something, it's the world is a better place if there are people who are excellent at, I don't know, running, right? The case that you describe is maybe a little easier for everyone to agree on. But I think, or, being a good artist or anything like that, it doesn't have to be a moral virtue in the kind of traditional sense.
Yeah, right. So wanting to become the strongest person in the world or the best weightlifter or something, this could also be a virtuous form of envy if you envy someone who's stronger than you or...
That's what I would think, because if that motivates you, again, if what drives you is not beating the other guy, but looking at the other guy who's strong, or gal, or other person who's stronger than you, as a way to helping you achieve your goal and kind of goading you toward excellence. Some philosophers will balk at this because they think that there is something inherently bad about comparison, right? Some people talk about how you should never compare yourself to others. But I think that's just like... First, it's psychologically implausible because social comparison is an essential mechanism that is ingrained in us, that it's automatic, unconscious. It helps us make judgments about ourselves. Like, it's an absolutely basic function of our mind, and that's how actually a lot of cognition works. Just literally, we don't understand things without comparing them. and it plays also central social functions in our mind. So we have to compare ourselves to others. And then I think a lot of our very concept of excellence, and I'm not the only one who argued this, is inherently comparative. And if so, we might decide that we don't care about being excellent. We just want to be good enough. Now, even as I say good enough, I'm like good enough with respect to what kind of standard? So it's actually really hard to think about positive qualities for a sense of person while completely eliminating any kind of comparison. So yeah, but I think like, do you want to be strong? There is a way in which envy is going to be a mechanism that allows you to get stronger.
Yeah, so let's just explore this a bit more. I think it's interesting. Maybe people would think, look, we're under a lot of pressure these days to be successful and to have social media feeds that demonstrate that we're interesting people, having fun experiences. And yeah, there's a lot of social comparison out there with social media and the like. And I guess so people might think that leaning into envy is maybe prioritizing productivity over happiness, or it's beneficial, right? So you say that envy gives us this short-term boost to our motivation that admiration, merely admiring someone, does not do. You can sit back and admire someone, that's not going to produce the results. What we really need is envy for that short-term boost in motivation. But we might think, I guess, we're living in such a stressful world that we need to, as far as is humanly possible, and obviously you think it's to some extent not entirely possible, step back from social comparison, because we might be happier if we just focus on our own selves and our own goals in a kind of non-comparative way.
Yeah. So I have actually been observing a change within my own life along those lines. So the first thing I want to say is that there are different personalities, different cultural contexts, different ages. What is useful and beneficial to us at 18 may not be the same at 35 or 67 or 95. And also in a context where, as you say, hyperproductivity is socially prized and which sometimes correlate with, exploitation or excessive stress or all of that, then, maybe the boost that envy gives you might be more dangerous or might come with higher costs than benefits. And I just wanted to say that also, inspiration and admiration are emotions that do have some positive effects, but just more long term, and they might affect your ideals and values. But so it's not like they don't have any kind of motivational effect, but they're just more kind of diluted and in the long run. And so I do talk about how sometimes envy really is the thing that, kicks you off the couch, right? And makes you go train or exercise or apply for that grant or apply for that promotion and so on. And sometimes that's what you need, right? When you are in a productive season, when it's important for you to, again, I think one thing that I'm coming to think as of late is maybe envy is an emotion, an emotion of the young and less so of older people who, after all, might be looking for something different in the second half of their life, for instance. And I'm about there, right? I'm right at the, that middle age phase where I feel I've accomplished some things. And I'm also becoming personally, this is just a personal element, I'm becoming more and more attracted to certain kind of Buddhist practices. And Buddhism is very much anti-envy. I mean, Buddhism is about, even kind of eliminating the notion of a distinction between a self and others. So obviously, if you don't think that there is a self, then comparison doesn't really make much sense, right? So it's a very different framework. But you can kind of combine the two things in the sense. So if one thing that is important to remember, when I defend envy, I do not defend I'm not making a claim about intensity of frequency. I'm not saying that we should feel a lot of envy, that we should feel envy intensely, that we should feel it all the time. There's a time and a place, and it is compatible with what I'm saying that maybe the majority of the times we don't feel the right kind of envy. And even when we feel the right kind of envy, maybe we shouldn't indulge in it necessarily, right? We should be, it's still, all negative affect emotions have to be handled with care because they're painful for one. And so a lot of negative affect in our life is not good. But again, it's a dangerous emotion. Envy, even emulative envy, can easily devolve into its less positive kinds. But also I think we can be mindful about it in the sense that I might feel envy, and then I think it's a useful detection mechanism for what you care about, how you're feeling about yourself. So we should pay attention to our envy. And we might decide to, adopt strategies that make our envy more emulative, for instance. But I feel like that as I get older, even compared to a few years ago, I'm getting definitely a little more cautious about envy in my own life. But precisely for the reasons that you're talking about.
Right, yeah.
Precisely because we already live, I mean, maybe if we lived in a different kind of society where everyone is kind of sluggish, right? And now, I mean, sometimes I feel like actually my students, at my university, I feel they're very non-competitive, even though they're young. And I think they could use a bit more emulative envy. Like sometimes I'm like, look at what other people are doing. Why do you want to be mediocre? Yeah. I hope none of my students are listening to this. But sometimes I feel like this is a culture where they almost take pride in not caring about grades. And of course, grades are, the essence of comparison in many ways. And I'm like, dude, if you want to go to grad school with those grades, you're competing with, super achievers from like other schools. You're not going to get in, right? I mean, unfortunately, so here's the thing. When we live in societies that have scarce resources, and if you want to get those resources, comparison are essential. So if you are in that game, envy is going to be very helpful to you, and you got to feel it. Otherwise, you're just not going to get the thing that you want. You're not going to get the trophy. You're not going to get that spot at Google or, or in grad school or whatever you want to get. But from where I'm at, I'm like, okay, I can slow down a little bit.
Yeah. I had another question about self-esteem and competition.
Yeah.
Because in the book, you quote Robert Nozick, the 20th century Harvard philosopher, quite approvingly as saying that self-esteem is inherently comparative. And that's what explains why people have these otherwise quite strange envious preferences where you want to take something away from someone else, even if it will be destroyed in that process, or you want to spoil someone's good, even if then no one will have the good, and it's quite destructive. And he says, well, look, we have these preferences sometimes because our self-esteem rides on these comparisons. And so I was just thinking, can't people have self-esteem based on kind of a radical self-acceptance rather than a kind of self-superiority or self-equality with others? Couldn't people have, maybe it's not plausible, but couldn't people try and develop a kind of authentic self-acceptance? So they say, look, it's just good to accept fundamentally yourself, not to accept everything you do, not to accept that, not to think that you're always in the right, but just to say, look, I fundamentally need to embrace and accept myself, because that's the way to live a kind of serene or calm life. Is that possible?
Yeah. I mean, it does depend how we define self-esteem. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an Enlightenment French philosopher, talks about two kinds of self-love. In the second discourse on inequality, he has this kind of, he depicts this hypothetical kind of, how humanity, like sort of how society developed, and there's this sort of almost thought experiment in which he talks about how human beings had what he calls amour de soi in French, which is self-love, but a healthy kind of self-love, which I think sort of resembles a little bit what you're talking about. And I should say I'm no Rousseau scholar, so I might be butchering this. And then he talks about what he calls amour propre. I don't know how it's translated in English. Sometimes it's left untranslated, but it's a sort of inflated self-love. It's a sort of narcissistic love that is more susceptible to being wounded by other people's judgments. There is this idea that there is like a healthy kind of self-love and one that is too dependent on on comparison and what other people think of ourselves. I mean, the way we understand ourselves is always in relation to others, because we live in society. We're constantly immersed in a social network. And so I think we have to strike this balance between not being too reliant on what other people think of us, because, as the Stoics observe, we can't control what other people think about us, and people's judgment can be fickle, and it can be wrong, it can be based on superficial things and all of that. But at the same time, I don't know that I want to be the kind of person who loves herself no matter what. Because to some extent, it seems that we want to be sensitive to someone else's perspective, right? And so, I mean, I'm not saying that what you're talking about is the narcissist self-love, because clearly I don't think that's what you're talking about. And there is, again, I think there's a popularized version of Buddhist philosophy and the practice of mindfulness meditation, which kind of gets close to this idea of, radical self-acceptance, of thinking of yourself, you're good enough, and accepting yourself as you are. And part of me is really attracted to that. But part of me is like, but what if you're an asshole? Like,
what if you're not good enough? Yeah.
What if you're just not very good, right? And you do want other people to tell you, like, your self-esteem. I mean, at some point, in my 20s, I thought I was a great, I had to develop a pretty robust self-esteem, but also that involved some understanding of myself as having a variety of moral virtues. And then it was, a few friends that made me realize, like, no, like, they came to me and they were like, oh, but you do this, this, and this, right? And that mattered, right? Then they were right that I was not as good as I thought I was. And it was important for me to hear. But I don't know. I mean, I kind of oscillate between these two. And I think, what does it even mean to just, like, love yourself as you are? But sometimes you shouldn't.
Yeah. I guess the issue is more when we are underconfident or undervalue ourselves when we shouldn't, I guess, when we think, despite all the evidence that we are good at something or that we are competent in our jobs, we still think we're not. And but you mentioned friendships, and you make some claims in the book about friendships and relationships and also gender. And so you say, look, envy can be virtuous, even in friendships, even in romantic relationships. Being envious of these people can be good, and envy can be kind of part of love. But in the interest of time, I mean, I just wanted to briefly ask you a question about gender. So you said that envy is gendered in some way, or people's experience of envy can be gendered. Could you explain to listeners how that's so?
So the evidence on envy and gender is actually pretty weak and mixed. Last time I asked my expert social psychology friends who work on this, they kind of told me that actually there is not a lot of interesting gender differences. I mean, of course, culturally, there might be differences in the things that men and women envy. But one thing that I think has been discussed maybe a little bit more in psychoanalytic literature is that there might be less overt expressions of envy among women, because there might be, women might be less socialized to be explicitly competitive in a way that men are allowed to be, although I think things are changing a little bit. But what I think fascinates me more is especially the combination of love and envy, because there is a lot more intense female friendships than there are male friendships, unfortunately. And actually, it sounds like this is I don't think this is an essential. I mean, this doesn't have to do with being men in particular, because there have been cultures where I think male friendships were more valued. But I think especially, I think in the North American context, we have all this literature that talks about how men are just not able to have peer relationships anymore, especially older men. They tend to rely on women and their female spouses if they have one for their networks. And they have my partner often complains that like men are terrible at friendships. They don't know how to be friends anymore. I don't know if this is your experience, Will. But I think what's interesting is that then you have this kind of high, you have really high standards, high moral standards for female friendships, which are you're supposed to be very supportive of each other. There is a lot of overt expression of affection with women, like women are comfortable saying, I love you, and, all of that. But at the same time, friends feel envy toward each other. And so it creates this tension, because love and envy are often seen as completely incompatible, especially if you have this idea of envy as being necessarily malicious. And so traditionally, they are, for instance, in Christian theology, they're presented as opposites. And so love is supposed to be the remedy for envy. But then you actually have a lot of sociological evidence. You have literary texts that discuss how women in friendships can be full of envy. And I think that's a fascinating thing to study. And I think it's that actually is one of the things that fundamentally motivated by interest in envy, the way that envy arose in female relationships, both actually between mothers and daughters and also female friends.
Yeah. And your final chapter is called Political Envy. And so I had a couple of questions about politics and envy. So the first one, which is less about your book and more of a kind of maybe curveball question, or I'm not sure, but it was kindly kind of gifted to me by my friend Anna Milioni, a friend and colleague of mine. And so her question is about whether envy can get in the way of social progress, and whether when individuals experience envy, they kind of misdirect attention away from unfair social structures towards like specific personal comparisons, especially concerning wealth. So her example is of her landlady who owns multiple properties in Montreal, and of whom she's envious because the landlady owns all these properties and she, Anna, has to pay money to live as a renter. And so if Anna were to respond to this envy by kind of aspiring to be like her landlady, then this might be the wrong response. So rather than acting on her envy, it's like, I want to level up, I want to become like her, it might be better in the end, assuming that it's not just to have a system of kind of multiple property owners and renters who are insecure, then trying to become a landlord or landlady might not be the best response. We might instead think that we should put some of our energy at least into trying to distribute power more equally, rather than putting all of our energy into just trying to amass more power for ourselves. So to what extent do you think envy is a kind of detriment to social progress?
Yeah. It's hard to be brief on this with these interesting and complex questions. So first of all, I realize I never answered your initial question about envy and resentment, and this is a good place to come back to it. Yeah. So resentment is usually thought of as a moral form of anger directed at some kind of injustice or something that is perceived as injustice. Although it can be, we call it indignation, where it's sort of impersonal and it's from a third personal perspective. But when we feel that we have been personally wronged and it's an injustice, then we can call it resentment. And people, and a lot of scholars think that, resentment and indignation are good moral emotions, but envy is not. And in a way they are right, because envy is amoral. it doesn't concern itself with a wrong in that relevant sense, right? So it is more focused on one's own situation, and it's not really concerned with justice or injustice. And so I actually share a lot of concerns about envy in the book. I try to, walk this line and say emulative envy, it is dangerous. And I talk at length about why, in the case of the landlord situation, one could also argue, well, emulative envy, you might feel emulative envy in the sort of technical sense that you have with benign envy, where you want to improve your situation, but maybe the good at stake is not a really good one, right? And so it's not a genuine good. Perhaps becoming a successful landlord is, a lure of capitalism, but it's not something that we should actually aspire to. And so that's not emulative envy in the sense that I'm interested in defending. So that would be one way to agree with what your friend is saying. Imagine that I might feel some envy, and perhaps it's some kind of benign of emulative envy toward this landlord, and that might motivate me to make me want to improve the situation. But then at the same time, I might be informed by other people, right, who might feel other kinds of emotion. They might feel indignation at these landlords making too much money and exploiting their renters, or some of these renters themselves might feel resentment and be really upset that they are having to pay, all this money, whatever, whatever the issue at stake is. And that might, but these personal emotions, these individual emotions, but make us think more carefully about the world and the social structure that we live in. And emulative envy might be the first step toward a kind of a change of mind and realizing that perhaps we need to change the system. And I might also feel emulative envy toward other activists who are actually working to improve the world. And so, different in the same situation, like when I talk about emulative envy as supporting social change, it might not be the emulative envy of the person who wants to become a richer landlord, but it might be the emulative envy of the activist who wants to become more effective at activism, right? So it also depends what our emotion is directed at.
And then probably a final question. So you float this idea that you think hasn't really been discussed properly, which is that racism can involve envy, and that people who express racism can do so because they are envious of the races that they denigrate. And that seemed a kind of surprising and puzzling idea to me because, as you say, racism is normally thought to involve perceiving others as inferior, and wrongly so, whilst envy is about seeing others as superior. Yeah, you have this interesting claim, and then you apply it to different cases, including Asian Americans and Asian Canadians. So, maybe you could unpack that.
Yeah, so I think, in short, I think that it's true that a lot of racism has to do with seeing other people as inferior, although it always, racial stereotypes are complex. And so even if you take the most vilified racialized groups, which in many culture is, thinking in North America is Black people who are racialized as Black. And even in those cases, you might see envy. For instance, the hypersexualization of Black people contains some elements of envy, right? I hesitate to make examples because they're so, I don't know. I sometimes even mentioning and not using those stereotypes feels icky. But I mean, I'm sure people have an idea what I'm alluding to, right? That, Black men are hypersexualized in a way that I think denote some envy on the part of the racist who stereotype them, or the idea that Black people are athletic. In many cultures where there, for instance, in certain Asian countries, indigenous people are considered to be very artistic, that they have unusual singing voices. Those are positive attitudes that also are compatible with racism, and there is this kind of resentful, spiteful envy that is often present in racism. The case of Asian Americans, and there is some actual empirical evidence supporting this, is interesting because Asians are often considered the model minority. They're considered highly competent in certain professional domains, although then there are counterparts of where they're considered not, for instance, as artistic as other people. And then we see in the history of North America how the persecution of Asian Americans was connected to their being perceived really effective but cheap labor, where they were considered like hard workers who were stealing people's job. And so there's a combination of resentment and envy that is responsible for their persecution. And so I talk about some of that in the book.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's basically all the questions I had, although I'm sure we could go on for many hours.
Yeah,
if anyone would listen to a 3-hour episode, we could make it.
But I did want to mention my discount. My discount.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so if people are interested in buying the book, I have a 25% discount that they can use at checkout if they buy the book on Cambridge University Press website. And so they can insert PE25, and it's valid until the end of December 2026. So it's the perfect Christmas gift.
Wonderful, yeah. I'm sure it will be the envy of everyone around the table when that gift is
exactly.
brought out.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for listening. If you want to help this podcast and my mission to make philosophy accessible, interesting, intriguing, and helpful in people's lives and in public debates, please do hit follow. It's such a help in getting this podcast to more people because of how the algorithms work. If you want to be an absolute gem, you could also consider giving it a 5-star rating or even sharing it with a friend or on social media. Thank you so much for any help you can provide. A slight change to the schedule. The next episode will be released a few days early on the 27th of December. And that's because we're going to talk about the philosophy of New Year's resolutions, asking how philosophy can help us when we want to change things up in our life, and asking whether the classic New Year's resolutions are dragging us down. So do tune back in on the 27th of December for more surprising ethics. Or if you're listening from the future, you can head there right now. Thanks so much.